Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today, in this chapter we're tackling something absolutely fundamental to CSS: selectors. They're how we tell CSS which HTML elements to style. Without selectors, CSS would be pretty useless. So, if you want to control the look of your website, you have to understand selectors. In this lesson, we'll cover the basic ones, and I'll show you exactly how they work, right here in the code. Alright, before we go any further, let's clean up our workspace a little bit and get things organized. First, let's maximize our code editor so we have a nice, big view. Now that we have more space, we're going to close example.html, we don't need it anymore, and shut down the live server. Now, to make working with HTML and CSS even easier, we're going to vertically split our code editor. This means we'll divide the editor window into two sections, one on top and the other on the bottom. This way, we can have our index.html file in the top section and our styles.css file in the bottom section, making it super easy to see both at the same time. The exact way you do this depends a bit on your code editor, but it's usually pretty straightforward. Let me show you. See the tab for styles.css up here? I'm going to click and hold it, and drag it down towards the bottom of the editor window. See that horizontal line appear? That's where the split will happen. Now, I'll release the mouse button. And there we go. The editor is split vertically. Index.html is on top, and styles.css is on the bottom. Great! Now we have our index.html and styles.css files arranged vertically, one above the other. This makes it much easier to work on both at the same time. We can see our HTML structure and our CSS styles side by side, which is really helpful for web development. Now, let's see this in action. I'm going to open index.html in our live server. And here's our web page. To make this even more convenient, we're going to arrange the browser window and my code editor side by side. This way, we can see the changes we make in our code instantly reflected in the browser. This is how professional web developers work, and it's a great way to speed up your workflow. Alright, let's start with the easiest one, the element selector. This targets elements directly by their tag name. So, if I want to style all the H1 headings on my page, I just use H1 in my CSS. H1, that's the selector. It tells CSS which element to target. Now, anything inside these curly braces will apply to all H1 elements. Let's change the color. We've already got it blue, so let's make it green. Type color, green. Boom! All H1s are now green. Same goes for paragraphs. If we type font size, 16px, inside the curly braces of AP selector, all paragraphs become 16 pixels in size. Super simple, right? P is the selector here. Element selectors are great for general styling, but remember, they affect all elements of that type. So, if we add another H1 to our HTML, it will also be green, because of this H1 selector. Okay, but what if I only want to style some paragraphs differently? That's where classes come in. This HTML demonstrates that. We have 2 paragraphs in total, but only one in each div will be styled differently because of the highlight class. For example, I will give this P element class highlight. This means you're going to add a class to a paragraph tag. This is how you add a class to an HTML element. You use the class attribute. Its value is highlight. The class attribute needs a value, and in this case, you're setting that value to highlight. This is the name of the class you're creating. Now, in your CSS, you need to target this class. You do this using a dot followed by the class name, .highlight. This is how CSS knows you're referring to a class. So, the CSS selector is .highlight. Let's give it a yellow background. In CSS, within curly bracket, type background, yellow. This CSS rule says, any element that has the class highlight should have a yellow background. See? The paragraph with the highlight class is now styled. Because the P tag has class equals highlight, and the CSS has a rule for .highlight, the styles are applied. Classes are reusable, which is awesome. You can apply the same highlight class to other elements too. For example, if you change the second divs class from internal to highlight, then the entire div, and everything it contains, including the h1 heading and the p paragraph, will have the yellow background defined in the CSS for the .highlight class. In this example, the highlight class is used on both a paragraph and a div. This demonstrates that classes can be applied to any type of HTML element. The dot in the CSS selector .highlight is crucial. Without the dot, CSS wouldn't know that highlight refers to a class. We have two elements with the highlight class, a div and ap within the first div, and a div and ap within the second div. Both will be styled according to the CSS rule defined for .highlight. If we add a border and padding to the .highlight selector, like this, then both the div elements and the p elements that have the highlight class will have a yellow background and a blue border and padding 10px. The div elements will have the border dan padding around their entire content area. The p elements will have the border around the text content of the paragraph. Important note: the border is applied because both elements share the same class. If we had other paragraphs or divs without the highlight class, they would not have the border, or the yellow background. This reinforces the concept that class selectors target specific elements that have that class assigned to them. We've seen how classes allow us to style groups of elements efficiently. But what if you need to style just one specific element, something unique on your page? That's where IDs come in. Think of IDs as the VIPs of CSS styling. They're designed to pinpoint a single, unique element on your web page. The key here is uniqueness. You should only use a given ID once per page. Before proceeding, we'll close and reopen the CSS file to ensure the changes are loaded, allowing the CSS and HTML to be displayed adjacent to each other. In HTML, we use the ID attribute to give a unique name, or ID, to an element. This allows us to specifically target that element with CSS or JavaScript. Let's say we want to give a section the ID main content. The correct way to do this is to use a hyphen to connect the words section ID equals main hyphen content. Writing main content with a space in the ID attribute is incorrect. The space character separates HTML attributes, so the browser will interpret main as the ID, and content will be treated as a separate and invalid attribute. While main content, without the hyphen, is technically possible, it's not the recommended approach. The standard convention is main content, and you would target it in CSS with hashtag main content. Let's add some styling to our hashtag main content rule. We'll give it a border and some padding. Border, 1px solid black, padding, 20px. As you can see, that section with the ID main content is affected. It's absolutely essential to remember that IDs must be unique. Do not use the same ID multiple times on a single HTML page. If you need to style multiple elements identically, even if they are sections, use a class instead. Duplicate IDs can lead to unpredictable behavior and make your CSS incredibly difficult to maintain. To recap, use classes for reusable styles that apply to multiple elements, including multiple sections. Use IDs for styling a single, unique element on your page, including a single, unique section. This distinction is fundamental to writing maintainable CSS. Next, we have the universal selector, the ***. This selector targets all elements on your page. You use it like this, ***. It's often used as part of a CSS reset or normalization to establish a consistent baseline and reduce cross-browser inconsistencies in default styling, particularly for properties like margin, padding, or else. While the universal selector can be useful for resets and some global styles, it's crucial to use it judiciously. Overuse can have performance implications. The browser has to evaluate every element on the page against this rule, which can be computationally expensive, especially in complex pages with many elements. Also, remember that the universal selector has a specificity of 0. This means any more specific selector, like a tag selector, class selector, or ID selector, will override styles defined with the universal selector. To demonstrate the effect of globally setting all element margins to 0, I'll first remove any existing margin properties from H1 and P elements. Now, as you can see, there is space above and below the H1 and P elements. I will set margin to 0 on the global element. See? The space between the H1 and P is now gone. After we've globally set all margins to 0, we can still set margins on individual elements or groups of elements to whatever value we need. This is because more specific CSS rules will override the universal selectors rule. For example, let's say you want the H1 element to have a bottom margin. You can do this by adding a specific rule for the H1 element, margin bottom, 25px. Now, the distance between the bottom of the H1 and the top of the P is 25px. Even though the universal selector sets all margins to 0, this more specific rule for H1 will override that setting just for the H1 element. The other elements will still have no margins, because of the universal selector. How this works? CSS uses a system called specificity to determine which rules take precedence. The universal selector has very low specificity. Selectors that target specific elements like tag selectors, class selectors, or ID selectors have higher specificity. Therefore, if you have conflicting rules like asterisk margin, 0, and H1 margin bottom, 25px, the rule with higher specificity will win. Key takeaway. The universal selector is great for establishing a baseline, but it doesn't lock you into those styles. You can always override them with more specific rules as needed, giving you fine-grained control over the styling of individual elements. Now, let's get into some more powerful stuff. Descendant selectors. These target elements inside other elements. Take a look at our HTML structure here. We have a section with the ID main content, and inside, we have a couple of div elements, each containing an H1 and a less than P. Let's say we want to style the H1 only within this first div with the class internal. A regular element selector like H1 in color, green, would style all H1 elements on the page. That's not what we want. We need something more specific. This is where descendant selectors come in. We use a space to separate the parent element from the descendant element we want to target. For example, hashtag main content.internal H1, color, blue. Let's break this down. Hashtag main content targets the section element with the ID main content. Then, a space, followed by .internal, targets any element with the class internal that is inside the hashtag main content section. Another space, and then H1, targets the H1 element that is inside the .internal div. So, this entire selector targets only the H1 that is a descendant of both hashtag main content and .internal. As you can see, only the H1 inside the first div has turned blue. The other H1 remains unchanged because it's not a descendant of both hashtag main content and .internal. Now, let's look at the second div with the class highlight. If we wanted to style all H1 elements that are descendants of the highlight class, regardless of how deeply they are nested, we could use .highlight H1, color orange. This will target H1 that is anywhere inside an element with the class highlight. H1 within elements having the class highlight are now orange. Let me quickly nest the H1 inside a span tag within the highlight div. Even though the H1 is now nested deeper, it's still targeted by the .highlight H1 rule because it's still a descendant. Now, a quick word about specificity. What if we had two conflicting rules, like .highlight H1, color, green, and H1, color, red? Which one would win? The answer is the more specific rule. Descendant selectors are more specific than simple element selectors. In our example, .highlight H1 is more specific than just H1 because it targets the H1 based on its context within the HTML structure. This is why the green color overrides the red. Specificity is a crucial concept in CSS, and it's something you'll want to learn more about to avoid styling conflicts in your projects. Now, let's talk about child selectors in CSS. These are different from descendant selectors, and they give you even more precise control over your styling. A child selector, represented by the last then symbol, selects only the direct children of an element. Think of it like this. It only targets the elements that are immediately nested within another element, one level down. For example, if we have this HTML structure, with a section containing a div with the class internal, and inside that div we have an h1 and a less than p, a child selector like #main content, last then, .internal last then, h1, would target only the h1 within element, that is a direct child of the .internal div, which is itself a direct child of the #main content section. It wouldn't target any other h1 elements that might be nested deeper within the page. Similarly, #main content, last then, .highlight h1, selects the h1 which is a descendant of the highlight element, that is a direct child of the #main content element. In our example, this is the h1 inside the second highlight div. Here's how it looks in CSS. We use the last then to indicate the child relationship. So, #main content, last then, .internal last then, h1, color, purple, will make the first h1 purple. And, #main content, last then, .highlight span h1, color, red, will make the second h1 red. See how only the direct children are affected? If we had another div inside the .internal div, and that inner div contained an h1, the child selector wouldn't touch it. It's all about that direct parent-child connection. Child selectors are incredibly useful when you have complex HTML structures and you need to style very specific elements without accidentally affecting others. They provide a level of precision that descendant selectors just can't match. So, to recap, for child selectors, targeting only direct children. Space for descendant selectors, targeting all descendants. Understanding the difference is key to mastering CSS specificity and creating clean, maintainable style sheets. Now that we've seen how child selectors work, let's explore another type of combinator, sibling selectors. Sibling selectors target elements that share the same parent. We're going to focus on the adjacent sibling selector first. The adjacent sibling selector, represented by the plus sign, plus, targets the element that comes immediately after another sibling. It's very specific. It only selects the element right next door, so to speak. Let's see how it works. Imagine we want to style the paragraph immediately after the first heading in our main content section. We can use the adjacent sibling selector like this. This CSS rule says, target a less than p paragraph that is the immediate sibling of an h1 heading, which is itself a direct child of an element with the class internal, which, in turn, is a direct child of the element with the ID main content. Let's give this paragraph a different background. Now, let's see what happens. As you can see, only the first paragraph after the h1 inside our first div has the light green background. The second paragraph, even though it's also a sibling of the h1, is not affected. This is because the adjacent sibling selector only targets the very next element. It has to be right beside it in the HTML structure. If we were to add another paragraph immediately after the h1, like this, and if we kept the same CSS rule, this new paragraph would also get the light green background, because it is now the immediate sibling of the h1. The original first paragraph is no longer immediately after the h1, and therefore is no longer targeted. The adjacent sibling selector is all about that immediate connection. Only the element directly following the target element is selected. Now that we understand the adjacent sibling selector, let's move on to the general sibling selector. This selector, represented by the tilde, is a bit more relaxed than the adjacent sibling selector. Instead of targeting only the immediately following sibling, it targets all siblings that follow a specified element. Let's go back to our HTML. Remember, we have an h1 and several paragraphs within our main content section. With the general sibling selector, we can target all the paragraphs that come after the h1, regardless of whether they are immediately adjacent or not. Here's how we use it. This CSS rule translates to target all P paragraphs that are siblings of the H1 heading, which is itself a direct child of the element with the class internal, which in turn is a direct child of the element with the ID main content. Let's give these paragraphs a different style, say, a light blue background. Now, let's see the result. See the difference? All the paragraphs that come after the H1 inside that first div are now light blue, even the one that's not right next to the H1. The general sibling selector finds all the siblings that follow the specified element. It doesn't care if there are other elements in between. So, to recap, the adjacent sibling selector targets only the immediately following sibling. The general sibling selector targets all following siblings. This gives you much more flexibility in styling groups of related elements. We've seen how CSS selectors target individual elements and how combinators target elements based on their relationships to other elements. Now, let's talk about grouping selectors. Imagine we wanted to apply the same style to several different elements in our HTML. We could write separate CSS rules for each element, but that can become repetitive. Grouping selectors let us apply the same style to multiple, independent elements at once. Let's look at our HTML and CSS again. Currently, the H1 elements are styled with a purple color, and the P elements are styled with a red color. Let's say we wanted both the H1 and P elements within the .internal div to have a dark gray color. We could write separate rules like this. This works. But there's a more efficient way using a grouping selector. Instead of two separate rules, we can combine the selectors using a comma. Notice the comma. This single CSS rule now does the same thing as the two separate rules we had before. It says, apply the style color, dark gray to all H1 elements that are descendants of .internal within #main content, and apply the same style to all P elements that are descendants of .internal within #main content. This is what grouping selectors are all about. They let you apply the same styles to multiple, independent elements in a single, concise rule. It's important to understand that the elements don't have to have any relationship to each other. They are selected independently. The comma simply groups them together for styling purposes. Now, if we decide to change the color to something else, like, say, dim gray, we only need to change it in one place. Much easier. This makes our CSS more maintainable and less prone to errors. Grouping selectors are a valuable tool for keeping your CSS clean and organized. We've explored the essential building blocks of CSS selectors: element selectors, class and ID selectors, attribute selectors, and the very useful grouping selector which lets you apply styles to multiple elements at once, e.g., H1, H2, P. We also covered combinators, the descendant, space, child, greater than sign, adjacent sibling, plus, and general sibling, which allow us to define relationships between elements for even more targeted styling. Remember the subtle distinction. All combinators combine selectors, but not all combined selectors are technically combinators in the strict sense. Mastering these core selectors, including the grouping selector, and combinators is absolutely crucial. They empower you to style web pages with precision and efficiency, giving you fine-grained control and laying a solid foundation for more advanced CSS techniques. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the fascinating world of text styling, where we'll explore how to control fonts, sizes, weights, colors, and much more. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions about selectors or anything we've covered so far, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments below. We're here to help you on your CSS journey. And if you found this helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more web development tutorials. It really helps us out. We'll see you in the next video.